Good morning, everyone. Thank you for witnesses being here today. This hearing, entitled A Way Forward for Venezuela, the Humanitarian, Diplomatic, and National Security Challenges Facing the Biden Administration, will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, strenuous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length of limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email previously mentioned address. As a reminder to members, staff, and all others physically present in this room, per recent guidance from the Office of the Attendance Physician, masks must be worn at all times during today's hearing. Please also sanitize your sitting area. The chair used these measures as a safety issue and therefore an important matter of order and decorum for this proceeding. As a reminder to members joining remotely, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with our HRS 8 and other company regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they're not under recognition to eliminate background noises. I see that we have a quorum and will now recognize myself. This is our first subcommittee hearing of the 117th Congress. So I want to welcome all of our new and returning members. I look forward to working with each of you, Democrats and Republicans, to advance United States interests and deepen our engagement with the Western Hemisphere. I want to recognize my friend Juan Vargas, who will be our new vice chair. And I would like to welcome our new ranking member, Mark Green. Congressman Green and I met for the first time last week, and I am optimistic that we will be able to work effectively together on a bipartisan basis. I called today's hearing because I want to begin this Congress where we began last year, by shining a spotlight on the crisis in Venezuela. 2 years ago, I shared a hearing entitled Made by Maduro, where we discussed the humanitarian crisis caused by Venezuela's dictator, Nicolás Maduro. Unfortunately, while international attention seems to be shifting away from Venezuela, the crisis in the country has only deepened over the last 2 years. A report issued by the United Nations last September confirmed that Maduro's regime has committed crimes against humanity. Over 90% of Venezuelans are living in poverty, suffering under conditions made worse by the pandemic. Over 5.5 million Venezuelans have been forced to flee their homes. In April of 2019, I led a congressional delegation to the Colombia border with Venezuela. I met mothers who have walked hours in the hot sun just to get a meal for their children. I heard stories about family members with chronic diseases who could not obtain the medication they needed in Venezuela and were struggling to survive. I saw firsthand the suffering this regime has caused. For me, we, the United States Congress, what can we, the United States Congress, do to help end the humanitarian tragedy? We have a moral obligation not to turn away from what is happening in Venezuela. I am proud that the U.S. Agency for International Development has led the way in providing humanitarian assistance to the region. I salute all those courageous Venezuelans and international aid workers who are working in the country to deliver food and medicine. I want to recognize the efforts of the interim President Juan Guaido and his government. They are prioritizing the needs of the Venezuelan people by pursuing an agreement to vaccine deployment and by calling for the World Food Program to be allowed to operate in the country. I also want to applaud the Colombian government, in particular President Iván Duque, for his recent decision to grant temporary protected status to Venezuela. In the face of one of the largest refugee crises in modern history, Colombia has shown tremendous generosity in providing safe haven for Venezuelans. I urge other countries to follow Colombia's example and put an end to harmful policies like deporting Venezuelans back into harm's way. I also urge Congress to urgently pass legislation to grant temporary protected status to Venezuelans fleeing the crisis. House Democrats did this in 2019, and I sincerely hope that all of my colleagues would join that effort this year to finally provide the relief that Venezuelans deserve. Ultimately, note that an end to the humanitarian crisis requires a political solution. Ranking Member Green and I will introduce a resolution in the coming days expressing our bipartisan commitment to supporting democratic aspirations of the Venezuelan people. We must pursue a solution to the crisis with the urgency it deserves. I believe the U.S. must work more closely with our allies in Latin America and in Europe to advance a coordinated diplomatic strategy. We shall also be much more assertive in calling out the regimes that are helping to keep Maduro in power, including Turkey, China, and Iran, and especially Cuba and Russia. I am confident that President Biden, who has demonstrated a lifelong commitment to Latin America, will bring the international community together behind the goal of pursuing a peaceful transition that swiftly leads to free and fair elections. I look forward to hearing from the experts with us today about what the U.S. Congress and the new administration can do in close coordination with our allies to help the Venezuelan people in reclaiming their democracy. Thank you, and I now turn to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Cyrus, for holding this hearing on the ongoing crisis in Venezuela. It's an honor to serve as the new ranking member of this subcommittee, and I look forward to working closely with you, Mr. Chairman, on the various issues. And I do believe that when we met the other day, we realized you and I have a lot more overlap in the way we think than the traditional right-left side of the aisle. So I think we're going to have a great time standing up for the people in this hemisphere. Today we're discussing the political and humanitarian crisis caused by the illegitimate Maduro regime that has left a once prosperous country in political and economic shambles. The regime's socialist policies and endemic corruption have resulted in years of economic freefall, hyperinflation, and shortages in basic goods. Venezuela has a poverty rate of 96%, that has driven almost 6 million of its citizens to seek a better life in other regions. This migration crisis has strained the resources of neighboring countries in the region, including Colombia, our closest regional partner impacted by the Venezuelan crisis. In addition to the economic crisis, the Maduro regime is among the world's worst violators of human rights, including recent accusations of crimes against humanity by the UN's fact-finding mission. According to local human rights group Foro Penal, there are currently close to 330 political prisoners in Venezuela, not including the illegal detention of 6 American Cisco executives held on false charges and without due process. But the regime cannot carry out these atrocities alone. It has been bolstered by some of the world's most brutal regimes. The communist regime in Cuba has successfully exported its oppressive system to Venezuela and directly supports the Maduro regime's oppressive tactics and human rights abuses. Further, the Chinese Communist Party has provided billions in loans to the regime and was recently found to be sharing technology used to surveil political opposition figures. The Maduro regime has also strengthened ties with Russia, which has provided military equipment, and Iran, which has joined Russia in helping the Maduro regime avoid U.S. oil sanctions. The regime has also built ties with the region's non-state criminal actors, including FARC and ELN, U.S.-designated criminal groups who are allowed free rein in Venezuela to carry out narco-trafficking, illegal mining, and other illicit activities. I applaud the Trump administration for leading international recognition of the interim President Juan Guaido and for holding the Maduro regime accountable by imposing tough and necessary sanctions on Venezuela's state oil company and individuals accused of corruption and human rights abuses. Some claim that U.S. sanctions are to blame for the country's economic crisis. But I want to be very clear today. The Maduro regime alone is responsible for the crisis and for blocking humanitarian assistance from entering Venezuela. I applaud the European Union for recent sanctioning 19 Maduro regime officials, and I strongly condemn the Maduro regime's expulsion of their ambassador in retaliation. The United States has also led humanitarian efforts by donating more than $1.2 billion in assistance to Venezuela and its neighbors in the region to address this humanitarian crisis. And while the United States is proud to lead, I urge the rest of the international community to join us in this effort. I also applaud the brave efforts of the interim government and the democratic opposition, which has withstood violent oppression and has been illegally removed from the rightful posts in the National Assembly through Maduro regime's illegitimate elections. These brave men and women deserve our support as they seek freedom for the Venezuelan people. Additionally, I was pleased to hear that the Biden administration will continue to recognize President Guaido as the legitimate leader of Venezuela, and while I believe there is a role for multilateralism in addressing the crisis, the United States must continue to lead these efforts. The Maduro regime's continued subversion of democratic institutions, human rights abuses, and criminal activities demonstrate their unwillingness to reform. I believe that dialogue with this criminal regime cannot be possible without a clear demonstration that they are willing to negotiate in good faith. The United States Congress and this committee will play a critical role in overseeing U.S. policy in Venezuela and ensuring that we have a comprehensive strategy that will lead to a peaceful, democratic transition for the Venezuelan people. The crisis in Venezuela does not only impact our neighbors in South America, it threatens United States national security, and we cannot afford to allow it to worsen. I look forward to the testimonies of our witnesses today, and Mr. Chairman, working with you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Green. I will now introduce Mr. Feliciano Reyna. He is the founder and executive president of Acción Solidaria, an organization that has worked since 1995 to combat HIV/AIDS epidemic. Between 2005 and 2012, he also was president of Synergia, the Venezuelan Association of Civil Society Organizations. Mr. Reyna has coordinated relief efforts in Venezuela through Acción Solidaria since 2016 to address the country's humanitarian crisis. He is also a board member of the International Center for Nonprofit Law. Mr. Reyna holds a Bachelor of Architecture from Cornell University. Mr. Reyna, welcome. We welcome you to the hearing. We will then hear...
Thank you very much. Sorry.
We will then hear from Dr. Cynthia Jay Aronson. She is the director of the Wilson Center's Latin American program, a leading expert on Latin America and the Caribbean. She has testified numerous times before the House and the Senate, and has written many publications on the region, particularly on U.S. policy towards Latin America. She also served as a former foreign policy aide in Congress. Dr. Aronson holds a Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Aronson, thank you for joining us today. Our third witness is Mr. Brian Fonseca. He is the director of the Jack D. Gordon Institute of Public Policy at Florida International University and an adjunct professor of politics and international relations. Mr. Fonseca is an expert on U.S. national security and has written publications focused on Russian and Chinese engagement in Latin America, and Russian-Venezuelan relations. He holds a degree in international business and international relations from Florida International University and attended Sichuan University in Chengdu, China, and the National Defense University in Washington. Mr. Fonseca, we welcome you to the hearing. Finally, we will hear from Dr. Ryan Berg. He is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. His research focuses on Latin American and specifically U.S. foreign policy, national security and development issues, and the region's transnational organized crime and narco-trafficking. Previously, he served as a research consultant at the World Bank, a Fulbright Scholar in Brazil, and a visiting doctorate fellow at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. Dr. Berg obtained a Ph.D. in political science from the University of Oxford. Dr. Burke, thank you for joining us today. I ask the witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Reyna, you are recognized for your testimony.
Good morning, members of the subcommittee. As a Venezuelan implementing a humanitarian action program in Venezuela, I really appreciate your invitation to address this subcommittee today. Since late 2015, Venezuela's complex humanitarian emergency has caused deprivations on the people's rights to health, food, education, livelihoods, and access to basic services, such as water and electricity. Human insecurity has forced millions to flee, unable to cope with such daily struggles here at home. Understanding the nature and broad dimension of the humanitarian emergency and its effects in widespread loss of life and human suffering continues to be necessary to properly address it, finding the means to work through the barriers imposed by the political conflict, which have been an obstacle to scaling up much needed humanitarian support. In this challenging environment, over 120 national and international NGOs have partnered with the UN system, and many others are coordinating independently to implement humanitarian programs all over the country. Venezuelan NGOs not only were the very first responders in early 2016, but have continued building capacities to prove a progressively increasing humanitarian response. Despite fear of politicization of aid delivery among donor countries, the United States continues to be the largest funder of the humanitarian response, with over 40% for 2020. However, even though Venezuela has the world's 4th largest food insecure population, it had the least financed 2020 humanitarian response plan among 34 countries in need. Despite having the world's 2nd largest migrant population, Venezuela's appeal for the regional migration response in 2020 was $1.4 billion, while Syria's was $6 billion. Regardless of challenges, there are opportunities for the United States to scale up humanitarian support. 1, promoting multilateral engagement among donor countries to address both the humanitarian emergency in Venezuela and the migrant response in the region. 2, increasing funding for local Venezuelan humanitarian and community-based organizations, allowing for longer-term funding, at least 2 years at a time, strengthening local capacities for future sustained development. 3, continuing to support initiatives such as the agreement reached between the Humanitarian Aid Commission of the 2015 National Assembly and the Venezuelan Health Department, as well as the COVAX initiative and the Humanitarian Response Plan 2021. 4, engaging multilaterally and creatively with key actors within the Maduro government to open the humanitarian space, expand humanitarian action, and protect humanitarian workers and organizations serving people in need. 5, revising general and secondary sanctions which have an impact on the Venezuelan population already severely affected by the humanitarian emergency. Licenses for oil for diesel swaps, for example, should be extended again. 6, adopting the TPS for Venezuelans, joining the recent approval by the Colombian government. These humane and rights-based initiatives could also become a framework for a coordinated regional response. Distinguished members of the subcommittee, humanitarian responses save lives and alleviate suffering, adhering to the do no harm principle. Finding a long-lasting, non-violent, democratic solution to Venezuela's political conflict will take time. Without such solution, the humanitarian emergency will continue to take its toll on the Venezuelan people, forcing many more to flee. However, we all have a moral obligation, as Chairman Cires said, to save lives today, to alleviate suffering today. We cannot wait to do so once the political conflict is solved, for it will not be solved for a while. Not for the millions in need inside Venezuela, not for those forced to migrate who also suffer along the way, not for the region, which will also continue to be impacted. To save lives and alleviate suffering today and to continue contributing to a long-lasting, non-violent democratic solution to Venezuela's political conflict demands multilateral thinking and action by the international political, diplomatic, human rights and humanitarian community, as well as engagement with those who control power today in Venezuela. Together with Venezuelan political party actors, multilateral thinking and action must include Venezuelan civil society organizations on the ground, which have proven to have the capacities, commitment, courage to generate solutions to the humanitarian emergency, create opportunities for sustained development, and continue advocating for human rights despite threats and risks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reyna. Now we will hear from Dr. Arnson. I now turn to you for your testimony.
President, and notably, oops, I'm muted. Am I muted? Uh-oh. Am I muted? No, I'm not muted. Sorry. Okay. The prospects of a democratic transition in Venezuela have worsened. The armed forces, an essential pillar of regime survival, have remained united despite multiple efforts inside and outside the country to foster divisions. Maduro's repressive apparatus remains fully intact, with murders carried out with impunity in poor neighborhoods, political prisoners tortured, raids and attacks on non-governmental organizations. As others have pointed out, this growing authoritarianism has gone hand in hand with Venezuela's economic collapse. Because of that collapse, others have made reference to the refugee flows. The United Nations estimates that another 3 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees will leave the country in 2021. Countries in South America and the Caribbean are simply incapable of absorbing such large additional refugee populations, and the threats to social cohesion and political stability should not be taken lightly. In approaching the Venezuelan crisis, the US government should establish both long-term and short-term goals. The long-term goal is the one that we all know and has been long-standing in US policy, which is the democratization of Venezuela's political life via free, fair, and verifiable elections. So the question is, what are the short-term measures that can be adopted that could help lead to that outcome? First, now that the scenarios aimed at the collapse of the regime have been tried and have failed, it is important to achieve broad political agreements that offer some guarantees to the regime and its supporters in exchange for concessions. This constitutes a more fruitful strategy for stabilizing and democratizing Venezuela. As Feliciano Reyna was pointing out, humanitarian agreements can serve as stepping stones towards a more comprehensive settlement. Partial agreements build trust among the parties, and if they're successful, they build faith among the population at large in the possibility of negotiated outcomes. And as we've just heard, the discussions in Venezuela over ways for access to the COVID-19 vaccines through COVAX to carry out a national vaccination campaign are a hopeful step. The US government should not lead these efforts at partial agreements, but the Biden administration should recognize that the sectoral, the secondary, the individual sanctions, the criminal indictments give the United States tremendous leverage in Venezuela. prudently targeted sanctions relief in exchange for verifiable concessions, such as the release of political prisoners, an easing of the restrictions on humanitarian aid, the reform of the National Electoral Council, should be carefully considered as part of a broad strategy coordinated with Venezuelan civil society and other actors in the international community. In any negotiation, creating incentives, not just wielding sticks, is essential to bringing the parties together. Although U.S. sanctions policy allows for humanitarian exemptions, as the recent GAO report pointed out, these may not be functioning well enough to provide enough maneuvering space for humanitarian actors on the ground. Those humanitarian exemptions should be revised in coordination with Venezuelan civil society actors. The Biden administration should also consult with a broad range, not only of Venezuelan actors, but international relief organizations to clear up remaining obstacles. As others have mentioned, the Biden administration's oft-cited preference for multilateralism in foreign policy is an asset in approaching Venezuela. Multiple international partners of the United States have worked to maintain channels of communication with all sides. These include the European Union, the International Contact Group, the Lima Group, the governments of Norway and Sweden. All of these countries and organizations have as a common denominator their search for a peaceful, democratic solution to the Venezuelan crisis. And as my colleague Brian Fonseca will shortly indicate, we should not harbor illusions that the important international actors in Venezuela are Western democracies seeking a democratic outcome. Russia, China, Cuba, India, Turkey, and Iran have played a variety of roles in sustaining the Maduro regime. But we should keep in mind that their interests are diverse, as is their relative importance to regime survival. Finally, and to reiterate the point about refugees, the United States has done a huge amount to assist South American and Caribbean countries hosting Venezuelan refugees, but much more needs to be done. In 2020, the United Nations Refugee and Migrant Response Plan received less than half of the international funding that it requested and identified to meet the needs of Venezuelan migrants and refugees across the region. And special attention, as Chairman Sirdes pointed out, should be given to Colombia, which hosts more Venezuelan refugees than any country in the world, and which just extended temporary protective status for 10 years to the almost 2 million refugees within its border. The United States can and must play an ongoing leading role in mobilizing resources that are sufficient for Colombia, as well as other frontline nations that are directly impacted by Venezuela's ongoing meltdown. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now turn to your testimony, Mr. Fonseca.
Thank you, Chairman Series, Ranking Member Green, distinguished members of the subcommittee, of course, including my own hometown representative, Congresswoman Salazar. It is my privilege to address you today on the state of Venezuelan foreign relations and its short-term and long-term effects on U.S. policy. As already stated, Venezuela is in the midst of one of the worst economic contractions ever recorded. And because of that, the Maduro dictatorship continues to lean on a small group of states to remain in power. Russia, China, Cuba, Turkey, and Iran have all played important supporting roles for the regime. These countries helped Maduro bypass U.S. sanctions to keep the Venezuelan economy muddling through and provide technical assistance to help stave off internal and external threats. The questions before the House today is not whether the Venezuelan government is a repressive and corrupt authoritarian regime. I believe that's clear. Rather, what can we do to alleviate the ongoing humanitarian crisis, regain influence on the ground, displace our geopolitical rivals, aid in the restoration of democratic governance, and help pave the way for a prosperous country for the Venezuelan people? My testimony will focus on Russian-Venezuelan relations, but I must point out that Russia is just one of a handful of countries vital to Venezuelan domestic and foreign policy interests. The considerations binding Russia, Venezuela, and the others are far less ideological. Instead, these countries are tied together by common authoritarian political structures and economic and political opportunism. Furthermore, these countries all share antagonistic relationships with the United States. That is, regime survival combined with our policy position, for better or worse, encourage these authoritarian regimes to travel together. These countries also overwhelmingly prioritize their own survival well above their relationships. That leads me to conclude that these relationships, Russia, Venezuela included, are largely transactional and vulnerable to fracturing. The Russo-Venezuelan relationship has evolved a great deal since former Presidents Hugo Chavez and Vladimir Putin first met in Moscow in 2001. Putin saw tremendous economic and political opportunities in Venezuela, while Chavez sought to diversify its foreign relations away from the United States. In subsequent years, Russian companies invested billions into Venezuela, largely focusing on arms and energy deals. Chavez also offered Russia political and military access on the ground in Venezuela. Interestingly, much of the surge in Russian-Venezuelan engagement occurred during the Maduro's tenure as Chavez's Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2006 to 2013. After ascending to office in 2013, Maduro sought to leverage his relations with Russia and others to stave off challenges from internal political opposition, offset the massive amount of money siphoned through widespread corruption and criminality, and mitigate the economic death spiral that accelerated shortly after he took office. Today, most experts would agree that Russia's direct business activities in Venezuela have not yielded the desired return on investment. Still, it maintains important economic interests, namely energy infrastructure and enduring arms contracts. However, the lack of direct ROI has forced the Russians to focus more on the indirect economic benefits and extracting political and geopolitical value out of Venezuela, primarily maintaining a geostrategic footprint near the U.S., portraying Russia as a global power, unsettling American policymakers, undermining Western democratic values, and scoring political points at home for Putin. In the economic context, Russia is just one of several countries vying for access to Venezuela's large proven oil reserves. There are clear indications that Rosneft and other Russian companies were taking huge losses well before U.S. sanctions. Despite the losses, Russia owns significant energy assets in Venezuela, including nearly 81 billion barrels of proven reserves via its joint ventures with PDVSA, that, by the way, it chooses to leave in the ground. One theory is that Russia is content with locking up Venezuelan oil in the ground and reducing global supply so that it can fetch a higher price for its own heavy crude on the global market. Russia exports roughly 9 to 10 million barrels of heavy crude per day. So a $5 increase in price per barrel would generate roughly an additional $50 million a day for Russian exporters. Thus, Russia may be deriving indirect economic benefits from a deteriorated Venezuelan oil industry made worse by U.S. sectoral sanctions. In 2020, Russia oil exports to the U.S. hit a 16-year high, solidifying its place as the second largest exporter of U.S. crude to the United States. Industry experts argue that spike in Russian imports to the United States is driven in large part by U.S. sanctions against PDVSA. Oil and gas are not the only drivers of Russian economic interest in Venezuela. Military sales are also an important part of Russia's broader economic interests. Building on military sales, Russia has established important military-to-military relationships with Venezuela. Russia provides technical assistance and offers professional military education opportunities for Russia for Venezuelan military personnel. Russia also maintains a formidable intelligence footprint in Venezuela. Although it's difficult to estimate how deep this aspect of the relationship goes, or whether these relationships will be enduring, Russian military and intelligence presence in Venezuela is not in our national security interest. Still, I assess the strategic intent for Russia is not directly challenge the U.S. military. Instead, I think it finds value in creating a low-cost opportunity to irritate the United States, but not necessarily provoke an escalatory response. Let me cover just a few recommendations if I can, and then conclude. I mean, to be clear, there's no easy path to transition in Venezuela, and there are severe limitations to what the U.S. can do now. Still, I think there are meaningful actions that we should be thinking about as the continuation continues to evolve. First, we should reevaluate our sanctions and consider doubling down on targeted sanctions against individuals and reversing broader sanctions that may be hurting our national interests and the interests of the Venezuelan people. There is good reason to believe that some of our sanctions are undermining our long-term domestic and foreign policy objectives. Our sanctions should not exacerbate the ongoing crisis, erode American reputation, or work in the interests of our global rivals. Second, we must find ways to enclose the important pressure release valves, or else the sanctions will do little to affect change. If the dictatorship can leverage its allies and use illicit trafficking proceeds to subsidize its struggling Venezuelan economy, meaningful change will remain elusive. Third, we should consider reestablishing some diplomatic and economic access. I'm not suggesting we reestablish an embassy without evaluating important concessions, but we should look to regain some diplomatic footprint. We should also create space for the American private sector to outcompete Russia, China, and others taking advantage of the U.S. absence. There's certainly a clear preference for American businesses over Russia, China, Iran, and Turkey. Finally, we should consider bolstering the governance capacity and reassure our partners in the region, especially Venezuela's neighbors, Guyana, Colombia, and Peru, and consider working more closely with our international allies, especially the UK, France, and Canada, which all maintain diplomatic relations. The fact that this is among the first hearings of the 117th Congress and the first for this committee is a testament to the importance of Venezuela to the United States and our commitment to the Venezuelan people. As I said before this committee in 2019, nature abhors a vacuum. If we don't have a presence, then China, Russia, Iran, and others antithetical to our interest and the interests of the Venezuelan people will be more than happy to fill that void. Again, thank you for this amazing opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Dr. Berg, you are recognized for your testimony.
Chairman Cease, Ranking Member Green, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on this timely topic today. Political and economic devastation wrought by the Maduro regime in Venezuela, Latin America's erstwhile wealthiest country, is truly unprecedented. The country has lost 20% of its pre-crisis population, 5 to 6 million refugees, a number that could rise to as many as 10 million by 2023, according to the International Monetary Fund. De facto President Nicolás Maduro presided over the largest economic decline outside of war in world history, and his regime is now considered criminalized or a mafia state. Venezuela's institutions are so thoroughly penetrated by corruption and criminal interests that senior leaders, including Maduro himself, are actively participating in transnational criminal enterprises. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, the National Liberation Army, or ELN, and Lebanese Hezbollah all have received shelter and even material support from the Maduro regime. Maduro's Venezuela represents a combustible mix of national security threats that have metastasized throughout the hemisphere, leaving a wide open door beckoning the involvement of extra-hemispheric actors and U.S. strategic competitors that have seized on the bedlam in Venezuela to enter our shared neighborhood, sow chaos, destabilize the region, and augment their power projection capabilities. Russia has provided the Maduro regime with a critical sanctions-busting lifeline, as well as myriad weapons systems. China has provided more than $60 billion in loans since 2007 and traded repressive digital surveillance technology to further Maduro's control. And Cuba has remade the repressive organs of Venezuela's police state in exchange for oil. Perhaps the most concerning aspect of Venezuela's slide into chaos, however, are the bonds it has forged and solidified with Russia, China, and Cuba, in many cases turning transactional relationships into blossoming strategic partnerships, and even in some cases, outright dependencies. Venezuela has become a prime example of the phenomenon known as authoritarian export, or authoritarian learning, whereby authoritarian leaders share best practices in repression and adopt survival strategies based upon their prior successes in other countries. Like a family recipe, authoritarians have bequeathed to Caracas their best advice for survival. If not for Cuba, the Venezuelan regime would arguably not exist in its current form, and if not for Russia and China, the Maduro regime would probably have collapsed. As Venezuela's economy slips further into the abyss, however, the Maduro regime has doubled down on the narrative of a nation under siege and abdicated any responsibility for the country's collapse. I think it is critical to avoid misconstruing the realities of who is to blame here, because it means misidentifying the most appropriate strategies for addressing the unique security challenges the regime poses to the region. Mr. Chairman, I would like to use the remaining time available to highlight very briefly several policy recommendations for the United States. First, pursue a policy of management, not solutionism. The Biden administration should recognize that it has inherited a significant position of leverage, but it should resist the temptation to go big and rush into negotiations with the Maduro regime. A Hail Mary pass at this inauspicious moment could actually entrench the regime further. Second, attend to the unfolding humanitarian disaster. As we have all heard today already, this is the most underfunded humanitarian crisis in modern history. For comparison, Syrian refugees have received the equivalent of $3,150 per refugee, while Venezuelans have received a paltry $265 per refugee. Aid should be targeted to encourage and defray the costs of further integration of Venezuelan refugees in host countries such as Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and others. Third, monitor the effects of sanctions on humanitarian efforts. The Treasury Department should monitor potentially negative humanitarian consequences of our U.S. sanctions. The U.S. should seek to ensure the reliability of the humanitarian exemptions that are built into our sanctions architecture, and fine-tuning sanctions should be the first impulse, rather than simply lifting them. Fourth, avoid the siren song of negotiations until minimum conditions in the country are met. By some accounts, there have been nearly a dozen attempts to negotiate with the Maduro regime, and limited progress has been made with significant opportunity costs to the Venezuelan people. I will note that there is currently no consensus of what the minimum conditions would be for a negotiation, and major questions persist regarding the objectives, timing, process, and trust-building measures with the Maduro regime. Fifth, encourage the European Union to bring more pressure. While awaiting a more fortuitous diplomatic moment, the Biden administration should encourage the European Union to adjust its policy in a nod to reality. Quite simply, the EU's current approach is riddled with inconsistencies, and the pressure setting is insufficient to meaningfully contribute to a negotiated solution and to protect human rights on the ground. Sixth, broaden the diplomatic toolkit to complement sanctions. The US should employ non-sanctions instruments concurrently with US sanctions to achieve the effective pressure level. These instruments include legal referrals to international tribunals, such as the current case pending against Venezuela before the International Criminal Court, and anti-money laundering mechanisms and resource certification regimes to deter the Maduro regime's participation in the illicit economy. And seventh, and lastly, bolster intelligence capabilities. The failed April 2019 uprising announced from La Carlota Air Base in Caracas, and Operation Gideon, the failed 2020 amphibious invasion planned in neighboring Colombia by a sanctioned Venezuelan general, should prompt the incoming director of the CIA and the intelligence community to conduct a thorough investigation of intelligence failures in the country related to the Maduro regime's authoritarian resilience, and bolster US intelligence assets and capabilities in Venezuela. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to answering the committee's questions.
Thank you to our witnesses today. Now I'd like to ask unanimous consent that Representatives Omar, Steuby, Maliotakis, and Wasserman Schultz participate at today's hearing after all subcommittee members have had the opportunity to participate and question any of the witnesses. Thank you. And now we'll get into questions. I'll start by asking questions to our members. First, I'd like to say that for years, I have been saying that Russia and China participate in this Western Hemisphere in order to create anarchy, in order to destabilize governments, in order to play with our closest allies. Cuba has the security apparatus in Venezuela. Russia has selling arms. And one interesting conversation that I had with the Colombian embassy the other day told me that in 2019, 6,000 Russians visited Colombia. Last year, due to the pandemic, it dropped down to 3,000. The Colombian government expelled 3 Russians recently. I can only think that having Russia visited Colombia, 6,000. Colombia is not exactly a beach destination for the Russians. Plays into this idea that Russia and China will love nothing better than to create chaos in the Western Hemisphere. So I was wondering from our members, can you comment on that? Anyone? Don't all answer at once, just one. Dr. Fonseca?
Chairman, I apologize. I thought when you meant members that you were querying somebody else. No, I couldn't agree with you more. I absolutely think one of the primary objectives of certainly of Russia is to continue to sort of poke a finger in the eye of the United States. Keep in mind that, as I mentioned, I think they find it incredibly valuable to have a geostrategic footprint near the U.S. And I think that's one of it. And oftentimes that sort of this idea of reciprocity gets thrown into the discussion among experts that look specifically at Russian engagement in Venezuela, because oftentimes that reciprocity sort of pathways back to the pronounced U.S. footprint in Eastern Europe. And so oftentimes in the past, you've even heard rumors about the potential, trade-offs of maybe the U.S. kind of withdrawing its support in places like Ukraine in exchange for Russia withdrawing its support in Venezuela. And again, for now, that's all been sort of hearsay, to kind of listening to people on the ground. But there's no doubt that in the consciousness of Russia, having that geostrategic footprint is really vital, number one. Number two, I also think that, and this is inclusive of, by the way, that geostrategic footprint is also inclusive of China. Of course, the United States has a tremendous footprint in Asia, notwithstanding our support to Taiwan, our military access in South Korea, Japan, and broader sort of Southeast Asia, U.S. influence. But that's number one. So geostrategic value, having close proximity to the United States. Number two, they both have having a tremendous interest in undermining sort of Western liberal order, undermining democratic institutions around the world, and trying to strategically create space to sort of embrace, their authoritarian political models. I think that sort of lends itself to destabilizing democracies around the region. And we've seen at times in the past Russia leveraging information operations and other sophisticated technology means to be disruptive and impact sort of the political stability of partners across the hemisphere. So, Chairman, I couldn't agree with you more. I think China and Russia absolutely are intent on disrupting and undermining U.S. policy.
Thank you. I also think that we just don't pay enough attention to the Western Hemisphere. So as we don't pay attention, the Russians and the Chinese and all the other countries that are helping Venezuela fill that void that we have in the Western Hemisphere.
Mr. Chairman, if I might add to that,
sure.
I certainly associate myself with what Brian Fonseca just said, and I agree that the influence of China and Russia in Venezuela is counter to U.S. interests. But I think that one needs to separate the kind of involvement that the two countries have had. As Brian was saying, it's geostrategic. It's an opportunity for the Russians to mess around in what they call or what they consider the U.S. near abroad in the reciprocal kind of way that Brian was mentioning. China's interests have been somewhat different. China is the largest oil consumer in the world. Venezuela has the world's largest known oil reserves. And so the relationship has been heavily focused on oil extraction, and the $62 billion in loans approximately have now been repaid in oil, and there has not been any new money for some time. And the loans that were given in recent years were simply to allow Venezuela to continue paying back the loans that had been initially given. There's also, I think, the case that China has reached out to the opposition at various points trying to guarantee its long-term access to Venezuela's oil resources, independent of the political leadership of the country. So I see it as less committed to the survival of Nicolas Maduro and the regime overall, and much more committed to the long-term survival of its interests in the oil fields.
Thank you very much. Now I'll recognize Member Green.
Thank you, Chairman. Again, appreciate your opening remarks and appreciate the witnesses' testimony. I thank all of them for being present and their participation today. I think one of America's greatest challenges is China, and I am greatly concerned with their penetration into not only Venezuela but all of Latin America. And my comments are really to the whole slate of witnesses, whoever wants to jump in. In 2019, China specifically stated that the blackouts in Venezuela were because of cyber attacks from the United States. Obviously, a blatant lie. And one of my questions is, how do we confront this disinformation campaign from China in Venezuela and throughout Latin America?
Let me jump in on this here, Ranking Member Green. You well stated the cyber attack claim, of course, is spurious. Largely, the blackouts were a cause of the fact that there was not only corruption, but a failure to maintain the power grid in Venezuela. And also, something quite simply, somebody didn't bother to cut the vegetation around one of the main power plants outside of Caracas. And so that vegetation overgrew some of the power lines and ended up knocking off power periodically throughout 2019, as we saw. This is an incredibly important question in terms of the disinformation environment. It's not just China, it's also Russia, it's also Cuba participating as well. And I think in this sense, the United States can do its best to try to get reliable information to Venezuelans on the ground, to members of the opposition, in especially critical periods of time. We've seen the internet knocked off grid in really important periods of time around protests, around street pressure, around moments in time when the regime felt like it was quite vulnerable. And so this is one of those areas that kind of flies below the radar, but is quite important in terms of our ability to help the opposition on the ground. Given the lack of political space in the country to organize, the reliable presence of the internet is absolutely critical.
One other sort of taking that a step further, it appears that ZTE, China's big telecommunications giant, has created ID cards for the Venezuelan people, which essentially do the same thing that their social score system does, tracks their behavior, monitors their actions, can dig into their checking accounts, all of this. How do we stop that?
So, Ranking Member Green, I think it's an excellent question. I think it underscores the point of China as the real strategic competitor in the region. And Chinese tech proliferation has been growing rapidly, certainly for the last decade or so. The idea of the fatherland card, as you reference, is something that certainly we've been battling around in terms of how, sort of how to combat that. In Venezuela, perhaps it's very difficult, to sort of overturn that. But I think education, continuing to sort of dominate the educational space, not just, in broader Latin America, but wherever we can sort of reach in and help, educate consumers on the threats and challenges associated with China tech penetration. It's important for us to disaggregate good from bad. Not all Chinese activities in the region, I think, should be seen through sort of a threat landscape. But I do think we have to provide education as tech penetration becomes more proliferated across the broader hemisphere. And I think this is also consistent with, what Dr. Berg was saying just a few minutes ago about information operations. The Russians are incredibly sophisticated in terms of their ability, to affect impact on information operations. They all also have an incredibly sophisticated and forward-leaning cyber capability. In fact, lots of open reporting about that threat, and in fact, the Atlantic Council's digital analytics lab has done some really good work on assessing information operations and putting out recommendations that can help undermine sort of the effect of those information operations. And part of that is about sort of credibility of the source. The United States needs to remain credible as a source across the broader hemisphere. We have to ensure that our actions don't undermine our credibility, broadly speaking. And I think we need to continue to point out, and attack the credibility of Russia. And when China does it, call them out as well for proliferating just false information, that affects the social, political, and economic landscapes across the region.
My time's up, Mr. Chairman. I'll go in second round.
Thank you. Congressman Castro, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. This question is for Mr. Reyna. First, thank you for speaking to our committee about the important work that civil society organizations like yours are doing in Venezuela. I chair the subcommittee that handles international development policy, and so I want to ask you a question along those lines. As you know, on February 11th, Venezuela's opposition and Nicolas Maduro agreed to cooperate to purchase and distribute COVID-19 vaccines for 6 million Venezuelans. I think this is a positive step towards fighting the coronavirus pandemic in the country. And it's been reported that about 1.4 million doses of the vaccine will come from the World Health Organization-linked COVAX initiative, while the source of the rest of the vaccines is yet unclear. So my question is, how can the United States help mobilize resources to ensure countries in need like Venezuela receive the appropriate amount of vaccines? And how can we ensure that there's a proper oversight and equitable distribution of those vaccines in Venezuela?
Thank you very much for your question. I think this is really important. One way in which it is possible to continue providing support in regards to health and with vaccination particularly is to support these efforts that the Humanitarian Aid Commission of the 2015 National Assembly has been carrying on, and also being able to work with the Pan American Health Organization, as well as with the Health Department of Venezuela. I think this is one example of possibilities that still exist to provide support, and the signing of this COVAX agreement, it's also a show of those possibilities. So we did have a previous agreement, now this COVAX one, and the oversight and the mobilization to expand on the one hand, and the oversight, one perhaps can be achieved through supporting the entrance into Venezuela of the World Food Program with its logistical capacities. We're seeing a huge challenge there with issues, for example, of cold chain. And since our transportation infrastructure has been also somewhat collapsed, as many other areas, then the World Food Program can play an important role. And in regards to oversight, we're proposing to follow the model that has already been in place since 2018 by the Global Fund for HIV, TB, and Malaria, Pan American Health Organization, UNAIDS, and Venezuelan civil society, again with the health ministry, to follow up on the provision and distribution of antiretrovirals. It has worked well with challenges, with difficulties, but that oversight has been in place, and there is a working group, monthly information and follow-up of the results. Whatever there is a gap or difficulties, then these can be called by the activists on the ground doing that oversight. So, these are the kinds of perhaps of mechanisms that would deserve looking into and supporting. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Castro. Congressman Pfluger, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for an excellent hearing on a very important topic, and to all of our panelists, thank you for your time. I've got a couple of questions. I'll start with Dr. Arnson. Knowing that Maduro it will not sign any sort of deal with the World Food Program unless he can control the distribution of that food. How do we, as the United States and working with our allies and partners in the region, ensure that delivery of food gets to the people that need it the most and can prevent Maduro from controlling that distribution?
Thank you very much for the question, Congressman Pfluger. It is an essential principle of humanitarian assistance that it must be given with neutrality and without any regard for the political affiliation of the recipient. Up until now, the Maduro regime has maintained tight control over food distribution through this program known as CLAP, through food boxes, which are woefully insufficient. And it is a form of social control, and it's obviously reluctant to relinquish that form of control. But I think what Feliciano was indicating is that on humanitarian issues involving health, there has been the possibility of reaching agreement between the opposition, the government, working closely with civil society organizations. I don't know what the magic formula will be to allow or to convince the regime to allow the World Food Program to operate. I suggested in my testimony that there might be some consideration given to relaxing U.S. secondary sanctions that would permit the import of fuel, gasoline, and diesel, which are in short supply. I know that that is a controversial recommendation, that we should not have to offer anything to Nicolas Maduro to get him to allow the international community to feed starving people. I mean, we're talking about, at a minimum, 9 million Venezuelans who are either severely food insecure or moderately food insecure, and that's the assessment of the World Food Program itself in 2020. So I think that these humanitarian agreements that have been reached over COVAX, the kind of things with antiretrovirals that Feliciano was mentioning, provide a kernel of hope that these kinds of agreements around food and food insecurity can also be reached.
Thank you very much. Now for Dr. Berg, my question is, what are the consequences to the U.S. And the region if this crisis continues and if these criminal groups are allowed to thrive, and specifically to our southern border? What is the threat with this crisis continuing, the number of refugees? Dr. Berg, to you.
Thank you very much, Congressman, for the question. I think the crisis has region-wide impact. As Dr. Arnson mentioned in her opening statement, the region is not poised to be able to absorb this level of refugees we've seen so far, about 5.5 million. Remember that figure that I mentioned in my opening statement from the IMF, that this could rise to 10 million by 2023. And so the numbers of people and the pace at which they're exiting the country is still unabated. And this really has dire consequences, not only for the stability and security of the region, but the future economic growth of the region. Many countries have difficulty not only absorbing this number of refugees, but also look at a country like Colombia. It's taken the very commendable step of including about 1.7 million refugees into its legal ranks. About 1 million of them will be affected by this temporary protected status that were granted to them. But that is going to be a Herculean undertaking, which the United States can help with, because many of us don't believe that countries in the region have the capability to absorb these types of numbers on the bureaucratic level, on the economic level, and the political level. There are political ramifications here as well. We've seen in some places, despite the fact that the region has had a pretty welcoming stance, rise in xenophobia. I mentioned Colombia before. I looked at a poll the other day that said a clear majority of Colombians were actually against the move by Iván Duque to allow temporary protected status for Venezuelans in the country. So the regional cohesion here is at stake as well. And the last thing that you mentioned is migratory crisis that could push north to our borders. Again, we've seen a lot of refugees in South America. As I think the next waves start to come out, we might see more and more actually traversing through Colombia, going up into Panama and into Central America, certainly more so than there are now. And if lastly, Congressman, I can just go back to the question that Dr. Arnson answered previously about the neutrality principle in humanitarianism. Obviously, it's absolutely critical. I think that there's one cautionary tale here, and that is the agreement that was signed last summer to bring in personal protective equipment and COVID PCR tests, which were very quickly sort of confiscated by the Maduro regime. They were not actually spread around the country in the way that the agreement stipulated, and the opposition since has been crying foul about it. But with the regime in control of those resources, there's not much that we can do at this point.
Thank you very much. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Congressman Andy Levin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. To our panelists, thank you. I'm going to try to ask a number of questions, so I ask you to try to be brief in your answers. A February GAO report, which I requested along with the full committee back in 2019, found that U.S. sanctions, particularly those on the oil industry, have likely contributed to the steep decline of the Venezuelan economy, and suggested steps that the Treasury Department and other agencies could take to mitigate the humanitarian impacts of sanctions, which some of you have addressed very movingly. Mr. Reyna, what recommendations do you have for the U.S. government regarding how it could provide clearer guidance to financial institutions or take other steps to minimize any second-order impacts of sanctions on the operations of humanitarian organizations that are doing their best in the situation?
Thank you very much, Congressman Levin. We really welcome that report. We think it offers information that is quite important, because one may think, of the impact of sanctions on issues that were already deteriorating. But to us, what is of serious concern today is impact on the Venezuelan population. And certainly there are some that can be worked differently. What we have had sometimes is conversations with Treasury, for example, to give precise examples of how sanctions can put obstacles and restrict the work of organizations. I think that is, having those conversations, even before imposing certain types of sanctions, would have made sense, and still makes sense to talk through them. One issue that we have faced, for example, is that, and we understand Treasury cannot impose, for example, let's say, issues on operations on the banking system, let's say, but they can offer certainly a more decisive kind of advice in order for the system not to prevent us from carrying on our humanitarian work, our accompanying, for example, victims of situations of lack of access to food or health. So I think this requires perhaps sitting down, looking at particular issues and seeing how to solve them. Licenses, for example, when we were looking at them, they might take from 18 months to 24 months to get. So again, it's not easy to even having license to get them for organizations such as ours here on the ground. So,
Okay.
I thank you for your concerns. And
yeah,
yes.
I tell you what, we'll be a partner with you in trying to work with the administration to help you do your work, basically. It's so important.
Thank you.
Yeah, the Trump administration's strategy towards Venezuela relied on maximum pressure, betting that sanctions would lead to a quick transition to democracy. But here in March of 2021, Maduro's grip on power appears stronger than at any point since 2019. It seems that in order to work towards a democratic transition, the U.S. will need a longer-term strategy. Dr. Arnson, it's good to see an old friend. Given reports that the Biden administration is reviewing its sanctions policy in many parts of the world, can you talk specifically about sanctions you think should be reassessed or revised, or how should we look at this in more detail than you may have gone into earlier?
Sure. Well, I would say that it's certainly not in the cards for the United States to be unilaterally lifting certain sanctions. But as I said in my statement, they do convey enormous amounts of leverage. The question is how they can be used in a back and forth to require verifiable steps by the Maduro government in exchange for certain forms of sanctions relief. Now that implies that the government is actually interested in that kind of sanctions relief. It may be the case that they're more interested in the lifting of criminal indictments or the lifting of these individual sanctions that have frozen bank accounts and prohibited them from traveling to the United States in the case of the EU, to the European Union. But I think it's very positive that there is a recognition at this point that the campaign of maximum pressure actually did not achieve either the democratic opening or the regime collapse that was hoped for, and therefore a different approach is needed. And I think that those consultations are underway and should be encouraged. And sanctions are, an instrument in the toolkit. And the United States has, because of the economic sanctions against the oil sector, the financial sector, and secondary sanctions on those who also trade with PDVSA and other Venezuelan entities, give us tremendous leverage, and we should explore, what combination of concession and sanctions relief should be desirable.
All right, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I see my time is up. Great hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman. We now recognize Congresswoman Salazar from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Wonderful to be here, and such an important topic for the Americas, and I thank the witnesses for their time and their expertise, specifically Dr. Fonseca, who is one of the most prominent scholars in my district, so wonderful to have you here. I have a different type of questioning, and I would like to start with Dr. Fonseca, just to take this to a more basic or granular topic where reality is more crude and it's more understood. So I'm going to do 10 questions, and I would like you to just answer yes or no, if it's possible. Is it true that Venezuela went from being one of the richest countries in the hemisphere to one of the poorest?
That is correct.
Is it true that inflation right now is over 4,000%?
That is correct.
Is it true that the Venezuelans can only go to the supermarket a few days a week because there are no goods on the shelves?
In most places, that's absolutely correct.
And is it true that the average Venezuelan has lost more than 15 pounds in the last 20 years because of lack of food?
That is also correct.
Is it also true that Venezuela is empowering Hezbollah, the terrorist group, and that the United States has indicted members of the Venezuelan Congress? It's like if one of us would be participating or working with a terrorist group. Hezbollah, do we know who that person is or who that group is? Is that true? Dr. Fonseca, did you hear me?
I'm sorry, I was muted. Yes, that is correct.
The dog got in the way. Is it true that the Venezuelan government is empowering the terrorist group Hezbollah, and that the United States indicted a member of the Venezuelan Congress for working with Hezbollah?
That is true.
And is it true that Venezuela is becoming a major hub for drug and trafficking, and that criminal organizations, their only purpose is to harm the United States?
They are absolutely a major hub for drug trafficking.
And is it true that Maduro's representative, the repressive apparatus is controlled and directed by more than 30,000 high-ranking Cuban agents like Ramiro Valdez? And they control even the Venezuelan Customs Office and the passport issuing office.
There is absolutely a heavy presence, and I know you wanted a yes or no, but I'm not sure that the numbers or what I'm seeing is high. I think, to your point, they still play a really vital role in firewalling the regime and absolutely have an important presence around Maduro, ensuring the survival of the regime.
And that the Maduro is blocking at this hour the aid for food and medicine that we, the United States, are offering to give to them so they can help their people. They are blocking it. Yes. and
That is right, yes.
And finally, is it true that 20 years ago, Hugo Chavez promised in an interview to yours truly that he was going to establish democratic socialism of the 21st century for the Venezuelan people?
Yes, I recall that interview well, and yes, he did.
Thank you. Now, my question to you and to the rest of the panelists, what can we do as a country to help the Venezuelan people?
I think, one, we have to continue to apply pressure and, again, look for ways to allow access for vital humanitarian assistance. I think we also need to continue to reassure and support Venezuelan neighbors and those in the region that are having to absorb millions of Venezuelans fleeing the country. I think it should be noted that the millions of Venezuelans fleeing the country are another really important release valve that allow the regime to muddle through by having to, having fewer mouths to feed in the country with an economy that continues to sort of move in a death spiral.
But there is one single thing that we could do as a country to help the Venezuelan people. What would that be?
Continue to apply pressure. I don't, unfortunately,
what type of
see
pressure?
A short term.
What type of pressure?
I think we need to continue to apply diplomatic and economic pressure. We need to continue to press for the admission of humanitarian assistance into support those. And again, I think we need to, I know you asked for one, but I also think that we need to shore up our allies and partners in the region.
I only have 50 seconds. Why don't you let me, Dr. Arnson, answer. If there's one single thing we could do as a country to help the Venezuelan people, what would that be?
It would be to work closely with our international allies, with the Venezuelan opposition, and with a broad range of actors in civil society that can come together around a common agenda, first for humanitarian issues, and then eventually to tackle some of the more difficult political and security challenges.
Dr. Berg, one thing in 13 seconds. What could we do as a country to help the Venezuelan people at this hour?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I would say, to reiterate what Mr. Fonseca said, pressure is obviously key. It has to be multidimensional, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. So it's not just sanctions, but it's sanctions and Congressman Levin asked a great question previously about sanctions and targeting. I think we can look at targeting.
What does targeting mean? I only have 14 seconds. One thing. What does targeting mean?
To look at the actual targets of our sanctions, the people on whom we are putting sanctions. The theory behind the maximum pressure campaign was that sanctions would be enough to dislodge Maduro. But unfortunately, the targeting of those sanctions has not been on actual military figures whom we all believe to control the security apparatus on the domestic level. So looking at targeting when it comes to our pressure will be key, Congresswoman.
Thank you. I yield back. My time is up.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Congressman Vicente Gonzalez, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Congressman Gonzalez, are you on? Yeah. Congressman Vargas, are you on? You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes, I am.
Sorry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me? This is Juan Vargas.
Okay, Juan. You're on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing, and I also want to thank the ranking member and all of the witnesses. Two things jump out at me in this hearing. One, our failure with humanitarian aid. That seems to jump out when I hear statistics that the Syrian refugees have received literally almost 10 times as much aid as have Venezuelan refugees. That's one. And second, our intelligence failures. Seems like we've believed that one thing was going to happen with sanctions and maximum pressure, and then it didn't come about. So I could start first with humanitarian aid. I'm very concerned about not only internally displaced people, but of course refugees also. How can we work better with the allies that we've all been talking about, both in the region, European allies, as we've said earlier? How can we work better with everybody to have a better result? Because the result right now is disastrous. I would ask that of Dr. Arnson.
Thank you very much, Congressman, for the question. I think that the United States certainly can contribute more of its own resources, but there are other ways to continue to mobilize the international community. There have been donors conferences convened by the European Union. We should press for more. They, of course, are dealing with their own influx of refugees from Syria, from Afghanistan, from other parts of the Middle East and Northern Africa. And it's a complicated situation there as well. But we could also look to mobilize more contributions by the U.S. private sector and work in partnership with other organizations like the DFC to provide employment opportunities on the ground for Venezuelan refugees and host communities in the region.
I guess I'm also very concerned about the food insecurity in particular. I mean, I have great respect for the United Nations Food Program. As you know, they just won the Nobel Peace Prize for all the work they're doing, but at the same time, they alerted us to all the millions of people in this world who may starve this year because of COVID and other issues. How can we work with the UN better, knowing that what the Maduro regime has been doing to manipulate the food distribution because they want to do it? What can we do? I'm very concerned about that. Dr. Arnson.
Yeah, well, you know, you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, the greatest source of the greatest obstacle to greater food assistance by the international community is precisely Nicolas Maduro and the rest of the Venezuelan government. The United Nations has dramatically expanded its footprint in Venezuela over the last 2 years. There are a variety of UN agencies that are on the ground, the Office of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, the UNICEF, and others. This does not include, at this time, the World Food Program. And I would note that, you know, there have been numerous efforts to take the issue of Venezuela to the UN Security Council. Most of those have served to just reproduce the polarization between the United States on the one hand and Russia and China on the other. But in bringing the humanitarian issue to the Security Council, that did provide an opening, and there was agreement on providing this greater opening for UN agencies to have a presence. So the bottom line is, you know, how do you force people to do something that they don't want to do? It's very difficult. And so the question is, can you offer them something which is not violating of your, you know, basic principles? Can you offer something in exchange? Right.
If I could just interrupt the last few seconds that I have. What about the intelligence failure? Why have we gotten it so wrong?
Is that a question for me?
Yes.
Well, you know, theories of political change are multiple, and there was the sense that by tightening the screws enough, you could create fractures in the regime, you could cause the military to divide. There were all kinds of ways in which, you know, there was the assumption that the Maduro regime would implode or cry uncle. and agreed to the kinds of things that the United States and others wanted, including, the Venezuelan opposition and the majority of the Venezuelan people. And that theory of change has proved false. And so I think it's to the credit of the Biden administration that they're now looking at alternatives and looking to see what, if any, kind of negotiations that involve the opposition, that involve this big tent civil society, organizations, academia, unions, et cetera, can collectively pressure for some real change.
Thank you. My time is expired. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Gonzalez, are you on the line?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Sorry, I had some technical difficulties there for a second. But my question is, there's, American companies have seen their investments severely affected by the crisis in Venezuela. And while Venezuela's oil capabilities have severely decreased, some energy companies have played a crucial role in preventing the total collapse. How can Congress work with the private sector to protect American investment in Venezuela, and how can the private sector assist us? I chair the Oil and Gas Caucus for the Democratic Party, and I have a pretty good relationship with some of the energy companies that are down there, and they seem to have, talk about intelligence failures, they seem to have a lot of intelligence, and they seem to know a lot of what's going on. How could we better work together, or are we, and it just hasn't been working out, to both protect our energy investments in Venezuela, and how can they assist us in structuring policy?
Congressman, if I can jump in on this one, it's a great question. So we have seen a lot of American corporation companies and American investment in Venezuela affected by the Maduro regime and its operations. I think you and I are both observing energy companies, for example, trying to operate under extremely difficult conditions, under conditions where they don't have proper partnership from PDVSA, with which they have to partner as a condition of being able to operate in the country. But there have been unique approaches by some American oil and gas companies to operate basically with the attempt of putting proceeds from those operations in, say, an escrow account, or some way of sort of siphoning it off or kind of bracketing it off to the side and ensuring that a lot of the proceeds from that activity does not actually flow to the Maduro regime and what his word would be sort of funding that repressive security apparatus. And so there are creative ways in which we can think about keeping American investment there and keeping a footprint on the ground, as Mr. Fonseca said in his opening statement, while also ensuring that that money is not actually fueling and funding the repressive apparatus there.
Congressman, can I make one brief addition? Again, I couldn't agree more with Dr. Berg, and I do think we need to create space for the American private sector to outcompete Russia, China, and others, and gain some access back on the ground. I can't underscore how important I think it is to unleash the American private sector and how that could provide consequential long-term influence and aid in ushering democratic transition at some point. The U.S. could consider the issuance of specific licenses to American companies that engage in sort of an oil for food, medicine, rather than the removal of sectoral sanctions in the near term. I think this would give the American private sector some access on the ground, as well as possibly help alleviate some of the humanitarian pressures. One of the things I'm most concerned about is the September 2020 anti-blockade law that was passed. I think Venezuela in the near term is going to be Maduro is going to be going through the process of privatizing, major Venezuelan assets. And I think, our adversaries are going to move in and try to consume those assets. And it might be very difficult to get them back at some point in the future, even if the hand or the pendulum swings back to the opposition.
Could I just add to that? I mean, I think that what Brian Fonseca said earlier, that nature abhors a vacuum, is really true. And if U.S. companies, particularly in the oil sector and mostly in the oil sector, are prohibited from producing, even if those assets go into an escrow fund or some other mechanism that's verifiable that doesn't benefit the regime, they're going to be taken over. And, I think one of Maduro's survival strategies is going to be over this next year precisely to privatize PDVSA assets and other government assets and look for international companies to step in and run them and buy them. And we know exactly who who will be eager to acquire a greater share of the economic life of the country.
Congressman, if I can just jump in here really quick and piggyback on what Dr. Arnson said. One thing that I think the regime is looking at here is that during this, the political and economic crisis in the country, there are sort of three types of crudes within Venezuela: light, medium, and heavy. The heavy crude is largely produced in conjunction with private sector and with international companies, and that has been, if you look at the oil output in the country, some of the least affected as compared to medium and light crudes, which has been some of the most affected, and that is entirely basically produced by PDVSA, the state-owned oil company. So I think the regime is looking at this very clearly and saying, as Dr. Arnson mentioned and Dr. Fonseca and Mr. Fonseca, privatization might be the way to go here in terms of being able to increase productivity, because PDVSA is essentially beyond repair in terms of its ability to actually maintain rigs and to contribute to an uptick in oil production in the country.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. We now recognize Congressman Stubbe from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, I want to thank you for allowing members who aren't on the subcommittee to ask questions. I appreciate that greatly, as these issues affect the state of Florida that I represent in my district. My questions are directed to Mr. Berg. President Trump signed an order on his last full day in office, which defers deportation of some 145,000 Venezuelans for 18 months. Venezuelans who are eligible for deferral can continue to live and work in the United States, similar to those included under the TPS program. President Trump blamed the Venezuelan socialist government and President Maduro for, quote, the worst humanitarian crisis in the Western Hemisphere in recent memory. Secretary of State Blinken even called Maduro a brutal dictator. The shortage in basic goods and medicine has forced these Venezuelans to flee the country. As a member of the Florida delegation, I know there is a significant number of Venezuelans in my state. What do you think the Biden administration's plan should be regarding President Trump's order that he signed on his last day of office?
Well, thank you for the question, Congressman. As I understand it, the temporary protected status was signed on the last day, but the details were left to the Biden administration. And so from that standpoint, I would certainly encourage the Biden administration to not only to implement, but to work out the exact details of the stay, the duration, the documentation, as well as the work permits, because it's not in the United States interest to send back Venezuelans to, as we've heard today at this hearing, a humanitarian disaster and a brutal dictatorship. I will also note that there's a real economic opportunity here with the number of Venezuelan migrants we've had in the country. Numerous reports of late have shown just how educated, how entrepreneurial, and how dynamic this diaspora is. And so I think from an economic standpoint, and particularly from your state standpoint, where there are quite a few Venezuelan refugees, it could be a huge economic boon if done the right way.
Well, Maduro has strengthened ties with, and it's been discussed already in this committee hearing, with Russia, China, Cuba, and Iran for political, economic, and military purposes. These malign external actors prop up the regime and perpetuate the ongoing humanitarian crisis despite U.S. sanctions. What steps can the international community take that complement or support U.S. efforts to counter support from these external actors to the regime?
Congressman, I can take a shot at that if that's okay. I think that's absolutely right. I think one of the things the United States, needs to continue to place pressure and leverage our allies, multilateral organizations, to continue to pressure specifically China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and Cuba for the activities they're doing on the ground to, keep the regime sort of muddling through, as well as, not sort of contributing positively to alleviating the humanitarian crisis. I think we definitely need to do that. And to sort of build off of a comment, that we made earlier, collectively, not having a presence on the ground allows our adversaries, our rivals, to certainly, run fairly rampant throughout the country. And so I think we need some presence back on the ground, not just from a sort of intel collection, but also to occupy influence space.
What steps can the U.S. take to counter efforts from state actors like Iran and Russia to support the regime in evading U.S. sanctions? Mr. Berg.
Great question, Congressman. I think one of the things that we've seen here is the regime's headlong push into the illicit economy, specifically as the sources of legal activity in the country have dried up. And so I've outlined a number of recommendations, both in my oral testimony, my written, as well as in other places, about certification regimes, for example, that we could seek when it comes to parts of the illicit economy, such as gold mining, which are very easily sort of brought into the legal economy through a number of maneuvers in countries like Colombia and in Brazil. And so those certification processes will be key. And a lot of it is just, about pressure, as has been mentioned many times here, is that we have quite a bit of leverage, and we would be wise to use it for the right purposes here rather than squandering it.
The Chinese Communist Party has helped the Maduro regime evade U.S. sanctions and is one of the regime's main financial backers, and has more recently delayed Maduro's debt repayment in exchange for shipments of oil. What does the Chinese Communist Party gain from involvement in Venezuela, and how does it reflect the nature of the Chinese Communist Party's influence in other parts in the region?
Congressman, I think that China's role in Venezuela, as Dr. Arnson mentioned earlier, it started sort of as a transactional economic sort of relationship, has now evolved into more of a geopolitical and possibly even strategic partnership. And so I know that there's been mention of the fact that there are no new loans that have been given to the country since about 2017. But the fact is, of the more than $60 billion in loans that were given since 2007, there's still a reasonable amount of that money that's outstanding. And so as long as China is carrying the burden, as long as Venezuela's debt remains in arrears, China in some senses is carrying the burden of this country's collapse. But nevertheless, I think for China, Venezuela at a standstill, and therefore as a major liability and potential strategic threat for the region, is actually to China's advantage in this broader geopolitical rivalry than a Venezuela working towards a democratic transition, possibly giving the United States an increased position or boost in the region.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We now recognize Congresswoman Omar from Minnesota for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to come and be part of your committee. My colleague Salazar from Florida asked her questions to everyone except the panelist who lives in Venezuela. So Mr. Reyna, I would like to give you a chance to address her question.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Omar. Perhaps not in just one issue. I have to say that aid has been coming in, not of course in the numbers that is needed, but just in our case, as a small organization on the ground, in 2 years we've brought in over 180 tons of aid and have distributed just last year 86 tons of aid in terms of medicines, medical supplies, and so on. My position here, my recommendation has been to engage, in spite of all the reservations, with some key actors within the Maduro government, as well as to continue working, for example, with the National Assembly of 2015's Commission on Humanitarian Aid to increase the number of aid, the amount of aid coming into the country. I think that if one looks at the humanitarian situation and humanitarian impact on the lives of everyday Venezuelans, this is a must. And so I thank you for this, but I do believe that it is possible. We have been able to do this in spite of challenges, risks, and threats, and even having some of our personnel and colleagues going through, difficult, risky situations, but we're still here, and we believe that this is possible. And once again, that engagement, to me, requires flexibility and creativity, but it's a must if we want to help the Venezuelan people.
Yeah. I am really grateful for the opportunity to hear directly from you. It hasn't been lost on me sitting here, hearing my colleagues engage on Venezuela and not having a single question addressed to you. So thank you so much. I'm hoping that you can expand on a couple of points from your testimony as you outlined. The situation in Venezuela is dire. People are going without food and medicine. And obviously to many of us, we believe that we can't allow people to continue to suffer because of our own domestic policies. Can you tell us how your work has been impacted by the canceling of licenses for oil for diesel swaps, and what other sanctions are proving to be significant barriers to the humanitarian response?
Thank you. There's one issue in particular that I think and that can be solved, I think, quickly, also as a show of good faith between both the U.S. administration, the Biden administration, and hopefully having bipartisan support, and the Maduro government. And this is lifting the sanctions on secondary, in the secondary sanctions on the swaps of oil for diesel. And this has quite an impact, again, on the population. The committee, the Human Rights Committee of one of the states of Venezuela, working with the Anti-Corruption Network, stated very recently, this was just last month, in February, Venezuela begins 2021 with a severe shortage of diesel, the fuel used to transport heavy cargo, foodstuffs for public transportation and thermoelectric plants. Essential groups report diesel distribution failures since the end of 2020. For the agricultural sector, this has brought paralysis on the field. And they go on with other issues regarding that. This in particular, I think it would be quite an important step to lift the sanctions on the oil for diesel swaps and open a conversation also in having the World Food Program coming into Venezuela with their capacities. Thank you.
And then just my last question to you, again, grateful for the opportunity to ask these questions. How is the political stalemate between Maduro and Guaido impacting your ability to do your work and just the lives of Venezuelans, since you are the only Venezuelan on this panel?
Thank you. I think that given the principles of humanitarian action, we have worked in our own space, let's say, even though we've had, of course, conversations, for example, again, with the Commission of Humanitarian Aid of the 2015 National Assembly, which is really important. I mean, if the aim is to help, it's to support the Venezuelan people suffering the consequences of the humanitarian emergency, that should be the consideration. So we have not been involved in the political conflict. It has to be solved. It needs to be addressed, definitely, but certainly we can find ways to have sort of a two-track kind of work. And the one that goes towards supporting the Venezuelan people suffering severely the consequences of the emergency can be worked out again. And we've shown that as civil society organizations on the ground.
Yeah, thank you. And Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Now we recognize Congresswoman Maliotakis. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for allowing me to participate in today's subcommittee meeting, and I really have found the exchange to be enlightening and a good discussion. For me, it's heartbreaking to see how the wealthiest country in South America has been destroyed by corruption and socialism. People, and let's make it clear, that the people of Venezuela suffer because of their own government, not for any other reason. And as a Cuban, the daughter of a Cuban refugee, it's all too familiar to me because it's very similar to what happened to my family. But we have an obligation as a leader of the free world to help the Venezuelan people. And I look forward to working with the people in this committee to achieve that. I was pleased when the Biden administration recognized Juan Guaido as the leader of the nation. But I am, I guess, a little upset about his announcement to re-enter the United Nations Human Rights Council without having any type of concessions. And as you know, last week, at the first day of the session of the UN Human Rights Council, it was Nicolas Maduro who was given a platform to speak. One of the biggest violators of human rights was given a platform to speak at the United Nations Human Rights Council. And I think we have an obligation to speak out against that. And I would like to know from the panel their thoughts on how we can utilize the leverage of President Biden wanting to return to the council and how we should be using that as leverage to try to get some accountability and to protect the human rights of not only the people of Venezuela, but of the nations that have propped up Venezuela, like Cuba, like Iran, like China, like Russia. And that's my first question. And the second question is, in terms of, it's good to have verbal support for Guaido, but what actions specifically do you think we should be taking as a nation to support him? Thank you.
If I can jump in on the UN Human Rights Council question, that would be great. Congresswoman, that's a great question. And this shows exactly the linkages that I mentioned in my opening statement. It was precisely the support of other authoritarian regimes, also on the Human Rights Council, like China, like Russia, to be able to help Venezuela win from the South America region when there were really no other sort of competitors for those seats on the UN Human Rights Council. And it's a total disgrace that Nicolas Maduro and his envoy in Geneva are giving the world lessons of human rights protection. So I absolutely share your concern. And as a matter of fact, AEI has done a report on reforming the UN Human Rights Council, which includes a number of things, actionable things that should happen before the U.S. Sits in that body again. So periodic reviews of members that are in the council, so a kind of policing of one another to make sure that the body doesn't become a gallery of suspect states. More competitive elections. In many cases, you have elections where there are really only a few countries on the slate to represent their region. And so you have a country like Venezuela able to slip through because it has the support of greater powers, but also it just doesn't face that much competition. We have to increase the level of interest here, I think, in terms of the desire to sit on this body. And part of that is going to be shoring up its reputation. And lastly, I'd mention that there should be some sort of review, I think, before you're even eligible to put yourself forward for membership in this body, that you comply with basic human rights standards, because as we've seen, quite a few candidates in UN Human Rights Council elections have been extremely suspect. And so those are three sort of tangible things that I would throw out there right away. But I absolutely share your concern that Maduro and his envoys were given time in Geneva to present human rights last week.
Please send me a copy of your report. I would like to read that. Thank you.
We recognize now Debbie Wasserman Schultz, a tireless defender of Venezuelan and human rights in Venezuela, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your indulgence in allowing me to moonlight as a member of your subcommittee and on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Some of you may know that I represent the largest concentration of Venezuelans in the United States. My hometown has so many Venezuelans that its nickname is Westonzuela, proudly so. And in my own neighborhood, we are surrounded in our midst with friends and neighbors who have family in Venezuela, who have themselves fled from Venezuela. I've heard harrowing experiences shared with me repeatedly of flight from political persecution, businesses confiscated, denial of basic food or life-saving medicines, and so making sure that we shine a spotlight on this plight is really critical. I want to ask Ms. Arnson and Mr. Reyna if they can talk briefly about the relief that declaring temporary protected status for Venezuela would provide to Venezuelans in the United States who feared deportation. And specifically, if you could address why TPS, which is a legal protection that is based in statute, offers better protection than DED, which was haphazardly declared in the last 16 hours of the previous president's term, and making sure, from my perspective, I have been pleased to see that President Biden has clearly indicated his plans to declare TPS for Venezuelans, and if you could share with us your perspective on the difference and why TPS would be preferable.
I don't know if Feliciano wants to go first. Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz, I'm not an expert on U.S. immigration law, but I think that what you have indicated in your question is true. That temporary protected status gives much greater certainty to Venezuelans that they will not be deported, that they will have not just a temporary stay of deportation, but also a number of rights to work in the United States and to have a life until such time as they may choose to return to Venezuela when the country is in a dramatically different circumstance. The deferred deportation is exactly that. It says we won't deport you. But there are many other things that go with being able to survive and live a productive life in the United States. And I think that the Congress has on numerous occasions in a bipartisan way endorsed TPS for Venezuelans. And I would certainly support that and hope that the Biden administration will follow through on its commitment, which it made repeatedly during the campaign.
Thank you, Mr. Reyna.
Yes, thank you very much, Congresswoman. I agree with Cindy that any status that would grant more rights to people in the United States who have migrated forcefully from Venezuela and who, if coming back, would really face difficulties, it's the right way to go. So again, without having the total knowledge of the migration situation in the U.S., I understand from what I've read, from what I heard from colleagues, that TPS would be the proper way to go. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Reyna, I know earlier you spoke about the need for the donor community to step up globally. I'm a member of the Appropriations Committee and, as I said, just moonlighting on the Foreign Affairs Committee today. But I'm curious about what more the United States should be doing. Particularly, where should we be focusing our efforts, our funding efforts within Venezuela, as well as neighboring countries like Colombia, who's taken in significant refugee and migrant populations, and also maybe throw in what about the rest of the international donor community?
Thank you. I believe that, again, and seeing the numbers and the extent of the situation here, that there is room for much more. There are reservations because of the political situation and manipulation, for example, of humanitarian aid. But this is a risk, I think, that has to be taken, unfortunately, because such is the situation in Venezuela. And that doesn't mean that one cannot overcome, for example, a narrative or propaganda or something like that. It can be done, and at the end result is really supporting a population. I think that there are others who should be coming in. Again, perhaps in a multilateral kind of reflection on the obstacles in Venezuela, why and how to overcome them. It would be possible to increase the amount of resources that are coming in. Working through the UN system is one way, is an important way, both inside and outside of Venezuela, but also directly through civil society, as has been happening so far. But perhaps this can be increased. And so there are different ways in which I'm quite sure that international cooperation can be increased in the case of Venezuela. Again, looking at the numbers with other countries in need, it really doesn't make any sense to see why is it that Venezuela is not receiving all the funding that it should receive for humanitarian aid. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We have votes at 12:15, so we're going to go another 10 minutes. The ranking member and I will have one more question. My question is to you, Mr. Reyna. Mr. Reyna, the reason you're a guest of our committee is because we recognize the work that you do inside of Venezuela. We recognize the risk that you take all the time. So as a recognition of your work and your effort, we want to make sure that we receive your thoughts here today at this committee. I happen to have visited Cucuta, Mr. Reyna, a couple of years ago. I have never seen anything like it. People from Venezuela worked hours and hours just to get a meal. There had to be a line of about 5,000 people. There was a line for the bathroom of about 500,000 people alone. And there's a priest that, through volunteers, provides the meal for these people. I think that priest should be canonized, the way he has organized and helped those people in that area. I was just wondering if your organization is involved at all in trying to help this particular part of Colombia, Venezuela, at all. Are you involved, your organization or any of your members are involved?
Thank you, Chairman Cires. We, as Acción Solidaria, we're not working on the border, but we are part of the community of humanitarian organizations on the ground. What you're describing is really is, you know, for us, this is sort of a daily happening, and it's something that takes you know, our time fully in terms of, I mean, even today we're having about 80 people at our doors receiving medicines donated, and this goes to about 1,400 to 1,500 per month. But we do have a large network. Some of the organizations on the border towns are working with the UNHCR and others in order to provide support for the displaced, internally displaced, and then also working with others outside of Venezuela to provide support for refugees and migrants on the other side of the border. So, and again, I think I really appreciate that you took the time to go to Cucuta to speak to the people and to see what they're going through. And hopefully also, perhaps this will, you know, as I was saying, you know, will lead to an increase in support, not only for what the response is here in Venezuela, but also in the region. We do need that, and the organizations that are working outside in this platform called Response for Venezuelans would really appreciate such support.
Thank you, Mr. Reyna. Now I recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I have heard throughout our discussion today something that made me think of a quote that I used to use when I was running my healthcare company. I used to tell my physician leaders that no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And I want to make sure that both the people of Venezuela who can hear my voice today, the international community, and all of our witnesses, and we want to help. We want to help. We want to help the people of Venezuela who are suffering one of the greatest humanitarian crises ever, and certainly the greatest economic collapse ever. But my concern is that if that assistance is funneled to and through the regime, it only empowers the regime's leadership. One example is Maduro's henchmen literally destroyed resupply convoys of humanitarian aid coming in from Colombia. So my last and final question is, how effective would relaxing sanctions be if Maduro is just going to seize, destroy, or misuse that aid?
If I could address that, Congressman Green, I mean, again, just to repeat, the Maduro regime is the principal obstacle to greater delivery. But as Feliciano Reyna was pointing out, there is, I think, a lot of experience in Venezuelan civil society, in the international community, in delivering aid in an apolitical fashion. And that has to be a fundamental principle. And to go to what a number of questions have touched on, I think that the scale, the resources for the humanitarian response, both inside Venezuela and outside Venezuela for the refugees and migrants, has to be dramatically increased. And there are multiple international relief organizations, U.S. relief organizations, church organizations, USAID, State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migrants that are involved in this every single day, and they just don't have enough. There's just not enough funding to go around. So I would encourage people as they look to what are next steps to help Venezuela to dramatically increase the amount of resources available.
Yeah, and I was, in my preparations for today's committee hearing, surprised to see the delta between the aid to Syrian refugees and the aid to the Venezuelan refugees. And I agree with you that disparity, I mean, we have got to recruit international partners to this cause. But again, my great concern is whether it's an NGO or governmental assistance, it's got to get past Maduro to get to the people who need it. And I appreciate your thoughts and your comments. And Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you, Ranking Member. And thank you, thank you again to our witnesses and the members for their participation in this important hearing today. The crisis in Venezuela deserves our urgent attention. I will continue to work closely with my colleagues and the Biden administration on a bipartisan basis to pursue a peaceful return to democracy in Venezuela. With that, the committee is adjourned. Thank you to our witnesses. Thank you very much.